The theme of this video is the myth of the American West. In particular, this video will focus on the agrarian aspect of the myth. In the next video, I'll discuss the expansionist aspect of the myth. All right, so the myth of the American West refers in general to the very significant cultural and ideological role played by the image of the American frontier in American culture, media, movies, film, politics. And it frames the notion of expansion for the earliest settlers here in North America. And that's because moving west was the inevitable move in order to expand, firstly, the colonies and then the nation. And the frontier is an important backdrop, let's say, for the development of a specific idea of the American character, as portrayed, for example, in popular Westerns. So, like many of the other myths of U.S. culture, the myth of the American West helps to formulate an image of the American character, the nature of the American him or herself. The American West as a myth, in particular in its relation to the idea of the frontier, shapes our thinking about the value of adventure, exploration, and self-reliance. These are major themes in American culture, American pastime, and they play a role, for example, in marketing. Right? So travel marketing might play on the idea of the value of adventure. Retail sales often plays on the value of adventure and exploration. Here I'm thinking, for example, about major clothing brands like LL Bean. Of course, the myth of the American West interacts with other prominent U.S. myths, such as the myth of the Promised Land and the myth of the self-made man. There's a way in which the myth of the American West is really an extension of the myth of the Promised Land, because the new Promised Land becomes the American West, the frontier, the land which is yet to be developed and conquered. And it's related to the myth of the self-made man because it portrays the American as self-reliant, as capable of converting the land into his or her own subsistence. So it conceives of the American, this distinctly American character, as deserving of the land as a result of their potentially unique capacity to survive and thrive in it. Okay, so Paul gives us an indication of some of the major aspects of this myth. And here I'll briefly explain some of these, and the rest of the lecture videos about this myth will cover these aspects. First, the West itself is a bit of a metaphor. It's not exactly some particular location, but it instead refers to the land not yet conquered. Right? So the West in the myth is a kind of moving target, right? Once the Louisiana Purchase happens and Americans start to develop the Midwest, right, then the target of future expansion will be even further west. And indeed, some who interpret the myth will argue that the West today is the globalized world, where America seeks to play a leading role in governing world politics. So we continue once we've expanded all the way west as it relates to the North American landscape to striving to control, dominate, conquer other places. From the nation's inception, secondly, the West was conceived of as a place in which the nation's future would be built. So as leaders planned the future of the nation, the West was the place in which that would occur, and we can see grand visions of this, for example, in the coordinate system of the Louisiana Purchase, which envisioned a sort of utopian landscape of small-scale subsistence farming, where American democracy could thrive. It engenders visions of an agrarian ideal, which conceives of authentic Americanness as rural rather than metropolitan. Okay. We'll say more about this in a bit, but the agrarian ideal is something like the superiority of rural life and of the value of cultivating the landscape. And as this being the distinctly American way of life, and many of the early advocates of this vision contrasted rural with metropolitan life and saw rural life as superior. It helps to foster a particular way of life, one associated with the pre-modern or anti-modern, traditionalism, folk culture, and specific cultural codes and idioms. So the notion of the American West helps to facilitate the American way of life, one in which a person is self-reliant, caring for the land, has mastery over the land, and has wisdom about how best to use the land. So the myth of the American West is bound up with a way of life. Related to 4, it helps to develop a pastoral image of life existing between the urban metropolis and the wilderness. So the West, in its agrarian mode, is not yet the city with all of its entrapments and developments, but it's not yet the wilderness either. It's this in-between stage where one lives among nature, but is distinct from it. Now, as Paul interprets the myth, there is a bit of a ideological paradox or tension. And this is the tension between agrarianism and expansionism. So the theme of this and the next lecture video will be about this tension. So you could take agrarianism and expansionism to be the two major interpretations of the myth, and they serve different ideological purposes. So on the one hand, the myth is associated with what we'll call agrarianism, which conceives of the West as a space of residence and settlement that is often imagined as a kind of garden or even Edenic paradise, so like the Garden of Eden, symbolizing pastoral simplicity and economic independence based on subsistence farming. This is a positive vision of the American West as a place where a particular way of life is lived, one that is simple, independent, and emphasizes self-reliance. And here we get the developing of an image of the American character which is admirable because of its capacity to thrive on its own in the midst of nature. So from this vantage point, the West is a place of subsistence, self-reliance, pastoral beauty, tranquility, and abundance. This is the vision of the American West that gets marketed, that gets branded, and is used as a sales pitch, indeed, for potential newcomers to the nation, especially early on. On the other hand, the myth is associated with expansionism, which views the West as instead a site of individual and collective quests for land and dominance. And so this is the sort of the maybe the more negative view of the myth. Right? The West is a place to be conquered through violence if necessary in order to dominate the land. Right? So here we butt up against the reality that expansionism meant, for example, continued violence against the native populations, right? And also inevitably violence against the land. Right? Although we require farming for our existence, farming is at times a kind of violent act on the land. It's an upheaval of the land. It's a remaking of the land, right? So from this vantage point, the West is instead a place of conflict, violence, survival, and expedition. And I think one of the interesting ways in which there might be a tension here is that the agrarian aspect of the myth, with its positive images of beauty and simplicity, might provide a kind of ideological cover for the expansionist aspects of the myth. Okay, agrarianism and America. The agrarian descriptions that we get of the American West provide a kind of positive and idealistic description of not only the land, but the role of Americans in possessing and cultivating it, right? So the agrarian vision is the vision of Americans living at one with the land, caring for the land, and capable of surviving in it. So agrarian societies, those are the societies that emphasize farming and the cultivation of land, and it has both an economic and cultural aspect, right? So it's a way in which one generates one's livelihood and provides one an access to money through sales of goods, but it's also has cultural significance in that the way of the life of the farmer is thought to be admirable and valuable. So one of the earliest thinkers to cultivate an image of the American as an agrarian society is Thomas Jefferson, who developed this vision in his Notes of the State of Virginia and enacted it through the Louisiana Purchase, which is the purchase of like essentially the middle third of the United States. That was a purchase from France. And Jefferson emphasized the agrarian lifestyle because he thought it fostered a sense of self-reliance and virtue. Here, there's a notion of the connection between working hard, caring for oneself, being able to take care of oneself on the one hand, and on the other hand, one being virtuous and admirable. And here we might infuse that interpretation with a biblical understanding of what virtue means. Of note, Jefferson contrasts this earnest nature of the rural American farmer who is self-reliant and is virtuous with what he takes to be the corrupt nature of the urban tradesman and merchant, thereby establishing the urban-rural distinction bound up with the myth. So Jefferson plays a role in helping to cultivate one of the aspects of the myth that Paul notes earlier on, which is that the myth entails a distinction between the urban and the rural, and additionally advocates for the superiority of the rural. So, why were Jefferson and others motivated to espouse this vision of America as agrarian? Why didn't they instead, for example, advocate for an America that was city-based or urban? It seems that the myth of the American West, as conceived of by Jefferson and others, had exceptionalist motivation. So again, as with all the other myths of American culture, the myth of the American West seems to play a role in cultivating American exceptionalism. So it seems that they sought to elevate the status of the American character. Right? And so if you're going to cultivate American exceptionalism, if you're going to provide an account of why America is an exceptional place, well, the one place to begin is by developing an account of why the citizens are themselves exceptional. And one way to do that is to conceive of them as self-reliant and independent and virtuous. Right? So bound up with the vision of America as agrarian is the vision of American citizens as self-sufficient, making them particularly deserving of the land. Thus, it seems like the agrarian aspect of the myth helps to solidify that early Americans were especially deserving of this promised land. Right? So portraying the American farmer as self-sufficient, on the one hand, seems to help to foster the exceptional nature of the American character. But, as Paul will note, it overlooks the various ways in which many farmers were quite dependent on various forms of labor, some of which were significantly oppressive. So, under the cover of the vision of the American farmer as self-sufficient, the reality is obviously much more complex, as many early American farmers relied on various forms of oppressive labor, including, most notably, slavery. So the agrarian aspect of the myth perhaps obscures the sins of early America, i.e. the cotton plantations of the South. So here we get a more general theme of the book and of this class, which is the way that the American myths play an ideological role in covering up for, turning our attention away from the significant injustices that occurred in the early formation of our nation. And then additionally, Paul notes that in characterizing America as agrarian, Jefferson aimed to attract Europeans seeking a new way of life. So this agrarian American ideal becomes a kind of sales pitch for potential newcomers. One motivation that Jefferson might have in mind here, especially as it relates to his treating the rural as superior to the urban, is his awareness that in Europe there is a nostalgia for the pastoral lifestyle of rural Europe, which is butting up against the development of cities within Europe. And so Jefferson is aware that he can use the notion of America as rural in order to bring more Europeans, particularly Europeans who would view this vision of America as attractive, over the Atlantic to help settle the yet to be developed land of the West. Okay, Croquevaux likewise employs the myth to articulate the superiority of the American culture and politics, and seeks to enmesh the two. So like Jefferson, Croquevaux sees the agrarian lifestyle as bound up with the American political system, as the agrarian lifestyle supporting the infant democracy by cultivating a particular kind of lifestyle that would support political and communal life. So by conceiving of America as a nation of cultivators, i.e. farmers, i.e. those people who are first developing the land, a sense of equal class and social status is achieved. If we conceive of America, and in particular the American West, as being occupied by one kind of person, i.e. the rural farmer, then we reduce class distinction and economic distinction, and so we achieve a sort of homogeneous social class, right? So we achieve, therefore, equality. As Christopher Curtis notes, Jefferson had something similar in mind. Curtis writes, and here I'm going to read the quote, but then I'll do my best to explain the quote. The quote contains a lot of detail here. Curtis writes, grounding Republican citizenship in the alloidal freedom expressed a belief that absolute ownership of a tangible piece of property would reconcile the indulgent characteristics of economic individualism with a vested social attachment to a particular local community, and accordingly foster civic virtue through self-interest. Okay, here Curtis is articulating the idea that by developing a sense of communal life that is facilitated by each farmer owning a plot of land and being invested in that land, America could reduce the sinful temptation of economic individualism, reduce the drive to having more than one needs, and instead would invest each person with supporting their community because their community supported their farm. So possessing a plot of farmable land, each citizen would be content with their lot. They'd have enough. But additionally, they would have an investment in the community, which their farming supports. And likewise, the community supports their farming. And this in turn would foster political participation and democratic virtue. In other words, having many farmers owning plots of land in a particular community would give them an investment in the community and would therefore foster active political participation at the local level, and this would foster democratic virtue. But, as Paul notes, this vision is undermined by various practical realities regarding labor on early American farms, many of which are alive and well today. Here Paul means that from the start, many unethical practices regarding labor were employed on early American farms. And many of the people who worked on American farms weren't able to participate in the American political system because they weren't recognized as citizens. Right? And this dynamic is alive and well today in the sense that many American farms rely on the labor of migrants who do not have legal status, maybe potentially have temporary legal status, but don't have any civic legal status. They're not able to participate in the elections, and so therefore they're not able to participate in developing the rules and laws that will govern their labor. So at the end of the day, the people who were able to participate in the democratic life of small communities was actually quite narrow. A perfect equal democracy was not achieved, especially in the early development of the agrarian mode of life in the United States. Okay, Paul also talks about the distinction between the northern and southern visions of the myth of the American West, and I think this is interesting to note. So Henry Nash Smith, the early American studies pioneer, observes the difference of application of the myth of the American West between northern and southerners, and this distinction here is itself a matter of debate, and I'll suggest why in a second. So as Paul notes, the southern image of the West casts the farmer as plantation owner, and for that reason alone is a far cry from the egalitarian dreams. Right? So egalitarian means a society of equality, everyone having roughly the same. Right? But for Southerners, the farm was the plantation, and the plantation had enforced labor, and it had a plantation owner, and so therefore it was highly hierarchical, therefore very unequal. So this southern vision of the West as promising equality is kind of incoherent. Right? the West as full of farmers who are plantation owners undermines the promise of equality and community coherence. Predictably, by contrast, the northern vision of the West, it took more serious the possibility of equal land ownership, and this tracks with the differences between the North and the South, which culminate in the Civil War. But even in the North, where more progressive attitudes regarding the equality of all persons were more prevalent, various exclusionary practices based on race, class, and gender persisted. Right? So, who were the farm owners? Well, they were white men. They weren't women or women of color, for example. And here we should push on this interpretation of the North as being culturally distinct from the South as it relates to practices such as slavery. On some interpretations, and here I'm thinking about, in particular, the way that Marxists will see our political attitudes being shaped by our economic reality. The difference in attitude between the North and the South on practices such as slavery had more to do with the conditions of economics and production than on moral principles. In other words, the differences in attitudes about slavery were at least partly the result of different farming practices between the North and the South, and these different farming practices were themselves the result of the differences in landscape between the North and the South. So here in the rocky Northeast, for example, it's not easy to do large-scale farming of the kind done on plantations. And this gave rise to a different demand for labor in the North than in the South. On this reading, had Northerners possessed land suitable for the production of cotton, they might have viewed slavery as more permissible. Okay, so this is just an alternative interpretation of the distinction. I'm not advocating for that interpretation, but it is one that is made. And so we should just reflect on how true it is that the North, in their attitudes about slavery, were pure, and on the other hand, to what extent were their attitudes motivated by various economic forces. Okay, so the Homestead Act plays a crucial role in sort of bringing the agrarian vision into practical reality. So this is a policy signed by Lincoln in 1862. The Homestead Act encouraged Western development and expansion by granting 160 acres of land to citizens promising to use that land for farming. Right, so this is an acting out of the vision. Right? We're going to give farmers substantial portions of land, and that will enable them to cultivate the land, to be self-reliant, but also to be members of small-scale communities, which will have a vested interest in maintaining the farming culture, and therefore will facilitate participation in politics. Here, Paul notes that there were some problems with this vision in practice because of a corrupt and inefficient system that facilitated land speculation rather than free settlement and small-scale land acquisition. Therefore, the consequences of the Homestead Act were not democratic land ownership. So therefore, as we divvied out this land, it wasn't the case that each plot of land was representative of a solitary, self-reliant American farmer. Actually, the data shows that it was much more complicated. So data from 1900 shows that overall farm ownership per citizen was much lower than the number of workers on farms, revealing that the act didn't lead just to equal land ownership, but a hierarchical system of labor. So many more laborers on farms in the land granted by the Homestead Act than farms themselves, which means that for each farm, there were many laborers on on a farm, which means that the Homestead Act didn't achieve its vision of independent American farmers cultivating their own land on their own, but rather enacted a system of capitalist labor. That's Paul's sort of critical interpretation of this, and I want to push back against that here, because I think this may be a moment where Paul is being a little cynical about the Homestead Act. And so here I just pose a counter argument. Was it actually realistic to imagine single families of farmers individually cultivating 160 acres of land? That's a big endeavor, right? And as a big endeavor, it necessitates laborers. It was necessary to bring laborers on in order to, especially in light of the lack of modern farming technology, to make that land suitable for agriculture and then to harvest the product of the farming. So perhaps the issue is not that many workers farmed the land that they didn't themselves own. That seems inevitable given the scale of farming that the agrarian vision wanted to achieve, but rather that the laborer did so under unfair conditions. Right? So I think we maybe need to shift the analysis here away from Paul's cynicism about the Homestead Act as such to maybe ask questions about the conditions under which laborers in individual farms worked. Okay, and then finally, we have ongoing contrasting visions of the American West. So to this day, the vision of rural American West plays a significant role in cultural messaging, marketing, filmmaking, novel writing, and storytelling. The American West serves as a backdrop for all sorts of narratives, for selling products, for selling the American way of life. Paul writes, to this day we find notions of America as garden-like and the American Adam as farmer in cultural productions ranging from historical novels to tobacco commercials. So, the American West plays an important role today in cultivating a sense of an American ideal. But this seems, on the other hand, to be a kind of nostalgia, maybe a nostalgia for a past which never even existed. Because after all, these idyllic images that we get in marketing, for example, or in filmmaking, stand in sharp contrast to the sharp decline in American farming, beginning with the Great Depression, but extending onward to today. So in 1935, there were 6.8 million farms in operation in the United States. And as of 2024, there are only 1.8 million. This is data according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And this is the result of all sorts of economic policies, but also changes in farming technologies, right, which give rise to a new form of agriculture. So the size and scope of operating farms has changed significantly, with more American farmland being cultivated by large-scale, technologically driven operations. Yeah. So here today we have, for example, John Deere tractors being programmed with AI in order to cultivate large plots of land fully on their own, right? And this makes less viable the small American farm, which plays a crucial role in the agrarian aspect of the myth of the American West. Right? So as technology changes, the viability of the small-scale farm comes into question. And we see this throughout our country. Right? So you drive through America, and really any part of America, here in New England, but also notably in the Midwest, you will find decayed, dilapidated, and often abandoned small-scale farming operations, which dot the landscape, right? Which shows that there's a real contrast between the sort of pastoral image of the American agrarian farmer on the one hand, and the empirical reality of what farming is today, which is large scale, technologically driven, and to the extent that it still employs laborers, it often employs illegal immigrants or legal migrants who don't have a say in the political system, which then governs their labor.